was supposed to be a night of celebration. Wine flowing, music thundering, nobles dancing in wild costumes. But then one man bursts into flames, then another. Screams rip through the ballroom, 4 men burn to death, while the king watches in horror. This wasn't a nightmare, it was real, and it shattered the French court. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how a single grotesque party trick helped unravel a monarchy and pushed a fragile king closer to madness. Let's rewind to France, 1393. The country was falling apart. They were deep into the 100 Years' War, a brutal fight with England that had already lasted decades. French armies were losing badly, whole towns were destroyed, and at home, things were just as bad. The Black Death had swept through Europe only a few decades earlier, and outbreaks still returned from time to time. Entire villages had vanished, farms were empty, crops had failed, and people were starving. On top of that, heavy taxes and constant war left the poor angry and desperate. It was a time of fear, death, and deep mistrust in the crown, and their King Charles VI was just 24 years old and already losing his grip on reality. He had started showing signs of madness just a few years before. Sometimes he couldn't remember his own name. Other times he thought he was made of glass, literally. He made servants sew iron rods into his clothes so he wouldn't shatter if someone touched him. He would go days in total silence, or suddenly lash out violently with a sword at his closest advisors. The people whispered, "Our king is broken." But instead of facing the crisis, the royal court tried to ignore it. They didn't call doctors or advisors, they didn't cut back spending to help the poor. They threw a party, a massive, wild, expensive celebration, filled with dancing, food, costumes and wine. And it wasn't even for royalty. It was the third wedding of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. That's right, a servant's wedding while the country starved. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary feast. There were plans for a special show, a performance so ridiculous and dangerous that people would be talking about it for centuries. It was supposed to make people laugh. Instead, it made them scream, because this night, it would go down in flames. To impress the royal guests, the court planned a strange performance. It was called the Dance of the Wild Men. It might sound like fun, but this wasn't playful. It was pure nightmare fuel. 6 men, including King Charles VI himself, dressed up as creatures from ancient myths. They were supposed to look like woodwoses or wild men of the woods, half-human monsters who lived in forests away from God, law and civilization. To look the part, they wore tight linen outfits that were soaked in pitch, resin and wax, the most flammable stuff you could find back then. It was basically medieval gasoline. Then, to complete the horror show, they glued flax fibers, dried straw onto their bodies to look like messy wild hair. When they moved, the fibers shook like fur. The costumes were terrifying and, honestly, dangerous even before fire came into play. These weren't just silly monsters, they were symbols of chaos, madness, and even the devil. In medieval times, people believed wild men represented what happened when humans gave in to sin and turned their backs on God. They were untamed, violent, and cursed. During the performance, the men would growl, shriek, and rattle iron chains, like demons breaking loose. It was meant to make people laugh, but deep down it was a twisted joke. A mad king dressed like a beast, putting on a show while his country burned. And everyone watching knew the truth. Those costumes were a fire waiting to happen. One spark, and those 6 men would ignite like torches. So the court set a rule, a serious one. No torches, no candles, no open flames, none, period. But not everyone followed the rules, and someone drunk, arrogant, and holding a torch was about to change everything. The performance had begun. The wild men were dancing, howling, leaping across the floor. The crowd laughed and clapped. The king, dressed as one of them, was in the middle of it all. And then Louis, Duke of Orleans, arrived. He was the king's younger brother, just 21 years old, and very, very drunk. He stumbled into the hall, laughing, holding a giant torch over his head. He wasn't supposed to bring it. Everyone knew the rule. No flames near the dancers. Their costumes were coated in pitch and covered in dry straw. They were walking fire hazards, but no one dared stop him. He was royalty, and he thought it was hilarious. He waved the torch, teasing the dancers. The flame got closer and closer. Then, whoosh, the fire jumped. It caught the costume of one of the wild men. He exploded into flame, then another and another. The fire raced across the floor like it had a mind of its own. The pitch, the wax, the resin, they fed the fire like it was starving. The flax burst instantly. It was like setting a haystack on fire. No time to stop it, no time to think. Screams filled the hall. Women fainted, men shouted and pushed. Guests trampled each other trying to escape. Some tried to smother the flames with coats, curtains, anything they could grab. But the fire was too fast, too hot, too bright, and the wild men, the ones on fire, ran in every direction. Through the crowd, screaming, burning, falling. Their bodies were torches, some were tangled in their costumes and couldn't even run. It wasn't a party anymore, it was a massacre. And the king, still out there somewhere, maybe burning, maybe already dead. 4 of the dancers, noblemen, lords of the royal court, burned alive right there on the marble floor, in front of bishops, knights, noblewomen and children. This wasn't some battlefield or peasant village. This was the royal palace of France. A place of power and wealth, now filled with the smell of burning flesh and melted wax. The fire had moved so fast most of the men never had a chance. Some were tied together with chains, part of the act. They couldn't escape. They screamed. They fell and they died in front of their king. And the king, he should have died too. He was in the middle of the dancers when the fire broke out, but someone moved faster than fear. Jeanne de Boulogne, the Duchess of Berry, only 14 years old, saw what was happening. While others ran away, she ran toward the flames. She yanked King Charles into a corner and threw her heavy silk skirt over his burning costume. She smothered the fire with layers of thick fabric. That skirt saved his life. No guards, no fire buckets, just a teenage girl with nerves of steel. And then there was Sieur de Nantouillet, one of the other wild men. With flames chasing up his legs, he made a split-second choice. He dove headfirst into a giant vat of wine. It was meant to keep bottles cold during the feast, like a medieval cooler. But that night it became a lifesaver. He plunged into the wine, the fire hissed out, and he came up gasping, soaked, burned, but alive. Yes, he survived the fire by cannonballing into the royal punch bowl. But the others, the ones who didn't make it, they were left behind, smoking, twisted bodies scattered across the ballroom, melted skin, burned bone, ash where silk used to be. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a royal horror show. And no one who saw it would ever forget it. The fire didn't just kill 4 men, it did something worse. It lit a fuse under the French monarchy. In the days that followed, shock turned to fury. Nobles, priests and commoners all asked the same question. How could this happen? This wasn't bad luck, this was arrogance, this was insanity in a golden crown. People whispered that the dancers had been chained together, literally bound by iron links so they couldn't escape when the fire broke out. They were dressed like beasts and burned like sacrifices. The church was horrified. Bishops called the tragedy a sign from God, a warning that the royal court had lost its way. Too much partying, too much pride, too little mercy for the starving people outside palace walls. And in the middle of it all stood King Charles VI, alive, but not truly there. The trauma shattered him. Whatever grip he still had on reality snapped. He stopped recognizing faces. Even his own wife, Queen Isabeau, was now a stranger to him. He would stare at her like she was a ghost. Other times he'd scream for hours, running through the stone halls barefoot, pulling at his clothes. He still believed he was made of glass. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. He made his servants move carefully around him, as if even a bump would cause him to shatter into pieces. Doctors didn't know what to do. There was no cure for a broken mind. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis. France was still at war, still starving, and now they had a king who couldn't tell real from imaginary. The court had thrown a party to distract from disaster, but instead they lit the match that would tear their world apart. They didn't just lose control of the country, they broke their king. The royal court knew they had gone too far. The fire had left behind more than ashes. So the court did what courts always do in times of scandal. They tried to cover it up, but it was too late. The horror was already being whispered across France. So just days after the fire, the survivors and the guilty were ordered to walk the streets of Paris, barefoot, dressed in plain clothes, no gold, no jewels, heads bowed, weeping. They made their way to Notre Dame Cathedral, begging for forgiveness. They cried in public. They called the fire a horrible mistake. They asked God to show mercy. But the people? They weren't moved. They had seen too much, heard too much. They knew this wasn't just a mistake. And so the fire was given a name, Bal des Ardents, the burning men's ball. It wasn't just a memory anymore, it became a warning, a symbol of a court drunk on power, a monarchy that threw a masquerade while the nation starved. A king playing dress-up, and while France fell apart, people would never forget the image. A ruler in costume, his court in flames, and the peasants watching it all from behind empty bowls. The Bal des Ardents didn't just mark the end of a party, it marked the beginning of the end for the illusion of royal control. After that night, nothing was ever the same. The fire at the Bal des Ardents didn't just scorch linen and silk, it burned through the royal court, the people's trust, and the mind of a king. Charles VI's madness could no longer be hidden behind velvet curtains and royal titles. One moment he believed he was made of glass, the next he forgot who he was. He couldn't rule. And without a stable king, the court began to fracture. Power-hungry nobles formed secret factions. Loyalty turned to betrayal. Family members became enemies. Brother fought brother. The crown became a prize instead of a duty. And just a few years later, France, already weakened by war and disease, descended into civil war. A brutal conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians that would bleed the country dry. All of it sparked by one torch, one drunken duke, and a party that turned into a funeral pyre. What began as a joke, men dressed as monsters, ended up revealing something terrifying. The real monster was already on the throne. The Bal des Ardents wasn't just a party gone wrong, it was a turning point. Proof that even royalty isn't safe from the fire they start, a mad king, a burning court, and a country slipping into chaos. If you love dark, dramatic stories from the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mysterious Anecdotes. We bring you the forgotten tales they don't teach in school. One scandal, one tragedy, one mystery at a time.